Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a place that somehow feels both impossibly far away and yet mildly familiar, like the smell of old library books or the quiet disappointment of opening your fridge and realizing someone has eaten the snack you were saving. We're floating gently down the Nile, where the air is warm, the stars are indifferent, and the pharaohs are, well, they're being exactly as strange as pharaohs tend to be. So settle in, get comfortable, loosen your shoulders, and let your breath fall into that slow rhythm that makes the world sound like it's underwater. Because tonight, we're exploring a topic that historians usually approach with latex gloves, emotional distance, and a silent prayer that their students never ask follow-up questions. Yes, we're talking about the sexual habits of ancient Egyptian pharaohs. And as always, the reality is stranger, softer, and significantly more awkward than whatever dramatic scene Hollywood would like you to imagine. Pharaohs, for all their gold, jewels, monumental tombs, and aggressively pointy hats, were still human. Humans with fears, insecurities, dynastic obligations, and extremely confusing ritual traditions that made even other ancient cultures go, are you sure about that? So let's drift, slowly and sleepily, into the incense-heavy hallways of those long-lost palaces, where royal bedrooms were political arenas, and intimacy was sometimes less about affection and more about cosmic alignment, divine symbolism, and keeping the royal bloodline from collapsing into what could best be described as a genetic Jenga tower. The Nile flows quietly outside, torches flicker, and somewhere a royal scribe is regretting every life choice that led him to having to document certain extremely personal details on papyrus. Let's begin with something gentle, a soft introduction to just how strange things could get. Because contrary to popular imagination, Egyptian pharaohs did not spend their evenings seducing half the palace like a heavily oiled Casanova. Many of them were exhausted, spiritually burdened, or so entangled in ritual purity rules that their love lives resembled tax paperwork more than romance. But the strangeness was still there, drifting beneath the surface like a crocodile with impeccable timing. And as we settle deeper into this sleepy river history, let's meet a figure whose love life reads less like a royal biography and more like the early draft of myth that the gods quickly abandoned. We're drifting into the story of the divine king who had to, symbolically, impregnate the land. Because of course he did. The pharaoh who had to fertilize the Nile. The Egyptians believed their king wasn't just a king. He was a living embodiment of Horus, the son of Osiris, the stabilizer of cosmic order, the anchor of the entire universe, which, as job descriptions go, has a certain overwhelming quality. This meant that the fertility of the land was tied, quite directly, to the pharaoh's sexual vitality. A completely unfair system, if we're being honest. Imagine being held responsible not only for your kingdom's politics and war campaigns, but also its harvest based on your romantic performance. And so, in some festivals, particularly the early ones, the pharaoh symbolically renewed the world by performing rituals that scholars politely describe as self-directed expressions of generative power. I know, perfectly delicate phrasing for something that ancient priests absolutely wrote down with very straight faces. This was connected to the myth of Adam, the creator god who brought the universe into existence through a particular act of solo initiative. The pharaoh, as Adam's earthly representative, occasionally reenacted this, though thankfully not in public, except for one festival in which, yes, it appears the act was performed at the Nile to bless the river, a detail that Egyptologists bring up only when absolutely necessary. The priests believed that the annual flooding of the Nile, the life source of Egypt, was tied to this symbolic renewal. And honestly, if you were the pharaoh living under that kind of pressure, you deserved at least a very long nap afterward. But this is just the softest edge of Egypt's dynastic oddities. Let's drift slowly deeper. Royal incest, not a bug, but feature. If you've ever thought, the pharaohs seem like they married their siblings a suspicious amount, congratulations, you're correct, and you've only scratched the surface. Egyptian royalty almost treated family marriages like a competitive sport. To the Egyptians, the royal family wasn't just aristocratic. They were divine. And divinity, at least in the mythological record, had a tendency to keep things close-knit. Isis married Osiris. Nephthys married Set. Shu married Tefnut. It's all very circular. So Egyptian pharaohs, wishing to keep their bloodline pure, not genetically pure, mind you, but symbolically pure, followed suit. This led to some fascinating dynastic family trees, where lines go in loops, siblings marry siblings, cousins marry cousins, and half-siblings marry each other so often that ancient scribes probably gave up trying to draw accurate genealogies and opted for vague gestures instead. Take Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II, who revived sibling marriage in the Greek-Egyptian dynasty with all the enthusiasm of people reinventing a bad idea. Or Akhenaten and Fertility, who likely shared closer blood ties than comfortable modern conversation allows. And of course, there's Tutankhamun, whose DNA studies revealed that his parents were full siblings, which explains his many health issues, frail bones, and the general aura of this child did not ask for any of this. The pharaohs believed sibling marriage kept the bloodline divine. Reality, meanwhile, quietly disapproved. Tell me in the comments, very gently, would you have gone along with the ritual sibling marriage if you'd been born into a royal family? Or would you have faked your own death and moved to Cyprus? No judgment either way. Let's drift onward, still sleepy, still soft, into the palace chambers of rulers whose romantic expectations made even their priests sigh. The pharaoh who married his daughter, and why that was normal. One of the most quietly uncomfortable facts about royal Egyptian sexuality is that several pharaohs married their daughters, not because they were chasing taboo or scandal, though they certainly succeeded at that, but because the symbolism mattered more than the person involved. The pharaoh was a living god, and the princess represented the goddess Hathor. In myth, divine father-daughter unions happen often, and thus the pharaoh reenacted this cycle to maintain cosmic harmony. The marriages were frequently symbolic more than physical, though we cannot claim that with absolute certainty in every case. Egyptologists often use cautious phrases like ritually affirmed, symbolic union, and likely ceremonial, which is academic code for we sincerely hope this wasn't carried out literally. Ramesses II married multiple daughters. So did Amenhotep III. So did several early kings whose names barely survived the centuries, but whose daring family choices certainly did. From the outside, it seems bizarre. Inside Egyptian theology, it was simply divine reenactment. And so the palace became a place where symbolism and biology lived in a state of tense, ongoing negotiation. Let's float onward. The pharaoh whose fertility was monitored like a seasonal harvest. The king's virility wasn't his business alone. It was tragically state business, monitored, measured, and ritually reaffirmed, often by priests who likely dreaded performance review season. Royal wives waited for pregnancies with the collective anxiety of an empire. Concubines existed not out of passion, but practicality. Some kings even underwent fertility tests, though the ancient versions were much less dignified than anything modern medicine would dare propose. Court physicians watched royal pregnancies, like meteorologists tracking storms. If the queen wasn't producing heirs, the royal concubines were quietly ushered in, each carrying the pressure of continuing the dynasty on her shoulders. It is perhaps the least romantic environment ever conceived, and yet the Egyptians infused it with poetry. Love songs survive on papyrus that describe longing, tenderness, and gentle devotion. They adored sensuality, celebrated the human form, and wrote sweetly about lovers meeting under the moon. Royal intimacy, however, lived under the crushing weight of cosmic duty. Imagine trying to relax in your royal chambers while knowing that your love life was directly tied to agricultural productivity. That is the emotional equivalent of trying to sleep while someone hovers over you asking, "Are you still breathing? Are you sure?" Tell me in the comments, quietly, like a whisper in a library. Do you think you'd survive royal marriage expectations, or would you pack your things and join a monastery instead? Now, let's drift to someone whose family life remains one of the most debated and sleep-disrupting topics in Egyptology. Akhenaten, the pharaoh who broke all the rules, including romantic ones. Akhenaten is the kind of ruler historians reluctantly assign to students because he requires so many disclaimers. He dismantled the traditional gods, moved the capital, invented a new artistic style, and ruled like a man who woke up one morning and said, "Let's do something wildly impractical." But his love life is where debates really begin. He married Nefertiti, whose beauty was legendary enough that her bust still captivates the world today. Their marriage seems to have been affectionate, unusually so for a royal couple. They had 6 daughters, which meant the court was perpetually swirling with political anxiety over heirs. But Akhenaten also had a secondary wife, Kia, whose identity remains mysterious, and who scholars suspect may have been the mother of Tutankhamun. Then there are the controversial inscriptions that suggest Akhenaten possibly elevated one of his daughters into a quasi-spousal role, though the exact nature of that elevation remains debated. Egyptologists tread carefully here, using phrases like ambiguous imagery and symbolic transference, and my personal favorite, ritualized intimacy of unclear literalness. A wonderfully vague way of saying, we don't fully know what happened, and honestly, we're afraid to find out. But one thing is clear. Akhenaten's household was a swirl of theological experimentation, deeply symbolic relationships, and a complete disregard for traditional boundaries, both religious and arguably familial. Let's float gently away from that before we all need emotional support papyrus. The concept of sacred prostitution. That probably didn't exist. Many ancient cultures practiced forms of ritualized sexual service in temples, but Egyptians seem surprisingly uninterested in that, despite sensational claims by early travelers and 19th century writers, who quite frankly wrote almost everything with way too much imagination and way too little evidence. Egypt had no tradition of temple prostitution. This disappointed early scholars immensely, who seemed almost eager to find such practices. Instead, Egyptian sexuality was private, domestic, and surprisingly modest in daily life. Public eroticism was rare. Nude imagery was symbolic, not provocative. The people were practical, affectionate, and deeply invested in personal relationships. Their pharaohs, however, well, they were living mythological reenactments, which is never good for a stable romantic life. Let's drift a little deeper into the quiet torchlight of the palace. The pharaoh whose wives were weapons. For some kings, romantic life wasn't about love or fertility. It was about diplomacy. Wives were alliances. Concubines were political treaties. Every royal union came with the weight of foreign negotiation. Thutmose III collected foreign brides the way some people collect souvenir magnets. Ramses II had a Hittite princess to solidify peace. Amenhotep III accepted foreign wives in such numbers that one diplomat complained Egypt was hoarding all the eligible princesses. And through all this, the pharaoh's actual emotional preference barely mattered. Every kiss, every marriage, every child was a political chess move wearing perfume. Tell me in the comments, softly, like you're sharing a secret. Would you marry an enemy princess for peace, or would you simply schedule a polite meeting and hope for the best? Closing the first night's drift. We've drifted quite a bit, from ritual fertility to sibling marriages to pharaohs whose love lives were as confusing as they were symbolic. And this is only the beginning. The currents of Egyptian intimacy run deeper, stranger, and more fascinating than most people realize. In the next part, we'll slide softly into tales of divine seduction myths, fertility magic, royal harems, and a few kings who took their romantic experiments to impressively complicated extremes. Before we drift onward, tell me gently in the comments, which pharaoh do you think had the strangest love life so far, and why? Let's settle back into the quiet dark of ancient Egypt, still drifting through those warm palace corridors where the air smells faintly of incense, lotus oil, and whatever the kitchen was experimenting with 3 courtyards over. The torches flicker softly. The marble floors hum faintly with night wind. And somewhere in the distance, you can almost hear the soft muttering of a scribe complaining about the ridiculous things he's been forced to write today. Because, as you've already seen, pharaohs had a way of transforming their personal lives into mythological reenactments that would make even the gods raise an eyebrow. We left off deep in the complexities of royal unions, symbolic marriages, ritual purity, dynastic fear, and diplomatic romance that probably felt less like affection and more like signing a very ornate peace treaty. But Egypt still has far stranger currents to drift through, and tonight we glide softly into the myths that shaped royal sexuality in ways that still puzzle historians who were merely hoping to specialize in pottery shards and now find themselves reading ancient metaphors for bodily functions they never asked to decipher. The next layer of Egypt's intimate world lies not in the rulers themselves, but in the myths that shaped their behavior, those grand tales carved into temple walls. where gods behave in ways that set questionable precedents for human kings. So breathe slowly, let the mind settle, and drift toward the realm where divine romance shaped mortal expectations. The gods who set questionable examples. Egyptian mythology is lush, poetic, and deeply symbolic. It's also full of divine relationships that modern audiences would likely describe as complicated, therapeutic intervention required, or let's never mention that in public. The early gods formed the Ennead, a divine family whose interpersonal dynamics directly influenced how pharaohs understood love, marriage, and reproduction. And, unfortunately for future genealogists, these gods were extremely fond of keeping things in the family. Adam, the creator, generated the first divine siblings, Shu and Tefnut. Shu and Tefnut then created Geb and Nut, and Geb and Nut created 4 more siblings, who also paired off. So from the very beginning, divine romance moved in a tight circular pattern, and somehow every pharaoh afterward decided this was the ideal template for royal marriage. You can almost picture the ancient priests reading these myths aloud during royal instruction, clearing their throats with quiet. Now, your majesty, please don't take this too literally. But the pharaohs did, and thus the royal family tree grew more loops and branches. Even more interesting is how these divine relationships were portrayed. For example, the earth god Geb and the sky goddess Nut were said to be locked in a perpetual embrace until the sun god Are demanded they separate. It was a myth explaining the order of the universe, but also gave the royal household a model for passion, cosmic, overwhelming, and occasionally requiring divine intervention. Pharaohs weren't simply following tradition. They believed they were reenacting these cosmic relationships, keeping the universe in balance through their marriages and unions. It's a stressful burden for a king who probably just wanted a quiet evening. But the myths get stranger still. Osiris, Isis, and the myth that shaped everything. One of the most important myths, and one that heavily influenced royal romantic expectations, was the story of Osiris and Isis. They were siblings, yes, but also deeply devoted. Their love was portrayed as eternal, powerful, and capable of bending the rules of life and death. According to the myth, after Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, Isis tirelessly searched for his scattered body parts across Egypt. She reassembled him piece by piece. But one piece was missing, the one that would make future pharaohs possible. Ancient Egyptians, in their ever-creative storytelling, explained that Isis recreated the missing piece through magic. She then conceived Horus, the future king. Egyptologists love to phrase this delicately. She engineered a symbolic restoration of fertility. The myth didn't just define kingship. It defined how pharaohs understood their own bodies and roles. They were living Horus. They were the result of that divine miracle, and their unions had to echo this cosmic pattern. You can almost imagine a young prince learning this story, nodding thoughtfully, and then thinking, right, so I have very large shoes to fill. Wonderful. But the myth also explains something deeper. Why pharaohs believed their romantic lives were inherently sacred. Every touch, every kiss, every air was part of the divine cycle. They weren't merely mortals. They were vessels of a cosmic story that had to be repeated over and over, generation after generation, until the gods themselves decided otherwise. It's beautiful in one way, and quietly exhausting in another. Let's drift onward, following the moonlit river toward an even more mysterious place. The royal harem. The harem, not the Hollywood version. When you hear the word harem, your mind might summon exaggerated scenes from old films, silk curtains, lounging women, dramatic lighting. But the real Egyptian harem was far less glamorous, far more bureaucratic, and probably much louder. The harem, known as the house of royal children and royal wives, functioned as a political institution, a household, and sometimes a miniature city. It wasn't simply a collection of women for the pharaoh's pleasure. It was a place where foreign princesses stayed, a nursery for royal children, a political arena where alliances were born, a center of diplomacy, a source of court drama that would make modern reality TV blush. Many harem women were essentially ambassadors for their homelands. Their presence signaled peace. Their children could become political bargaining chips. Their loyalties were constantly scrutinized. Imagine the quiet tension at dinner. A princess from Babylon on the right, a princess from Mitanni on the left, a princess from Nubia across the table, all of them smiling politely while wondering who was receiving the most attention this year. It must have been the ancient equivalent of a workplace where everyone is competing for the same promotion, but the boss is believed to be divine, and there's a priest taking notes in the corner. Despite these layers of diplomacy, the harem wasn't necessarily morally chaotic. It was surprisingly structured with internal hierarchies, strict schedules, and more rules than most modern office buildings. At the top sat the great royal wife, the queen. Beneath her were secondary wives, foreign princesses, and royal concubines. Beneath them were attendants, servants, musicians, cooks, tutors, scribes, and caretakers. The place constantly buzzed with activity: singing, meal preparation, children playing, disputes over jewelry, lessons in etiquette, and priests performing rituals to protect the future heirs. It was less a romantic paradise and more a bustling royal neighborhood with very high stakes. The pharaoh visited when time allowed, which, depending on the reign, could be frequently or almost never. Many kings were too busy campaigning, building monuments, performing rituals, or solving the crisis of the week to leisurely enjoy harem life. And sometimes the harem became a place of political unrest, like in the reign of Ramesses III, when a conspiracy emerged from within its walls. A dark episode we'll drift into later, but not yet, because we're keeping the mood soft and sleepy, not dramatic, for now. Let's glide quietly into something gentler: fertility magic and love spells. The Egyptians adored magic, not dark or frightening magic, but gentle, domestic, protective magic. They believed words carried power, objects carried blessings, and rituals could influence the heart. Love spells survive on scraps of papyrus that reveal a softer side to Egyptian desire, one filled with longing, vulnerability, and touching sincerity. Some asked the gods to bring a lover closer. Others asked for reconciliation. Some were written by men, others by women. These spells were not about controlling others, but connecting with them. A common theme appears: bring her to me with a joyful heart. Let him see me with new eyes. May we share bread and laughter. It shows something very human beneath the layers of royal formality. Ordinary Egyptians, and perhaps even pharaohs in quiet, unguarded moments, longed for companionship, tenderness, shared meals, and laughter. They weren't simply reenacting myths. They wanted warmth. Some used amulets shaped like Hathor or Bes, gods of music, love, and protection. Others wrote incantations on pottery shards or worn linen strips. Still others sought the help of wise women, healers who blended herbal knowledge with spiritual guidance. It was not the extravagant sensuality Hollywood imagines. It was quieter, softer, more personal. Egyptians approached love with reverence, humor, and a kind of gentle humility that suggests deep emotional intelligence. But royal intimacy? That remained tangled in expectation. Royal birth, the most politically charged event in Egypt. If there was one moment when romance, duty, divinity, and politics collided in the most spectacular way, it was childbirth. The birth of a royal heir was a national event, one that determined the future of the kingdom. The queen's pregnancy was carefully monitored. Protective spells were recited. Priests performed rituals. Midwives prepared birthing stools. The palace hummed with anticipation. And while the process itself was private, the announcements were not. Birth scenes were carved into temple walls, often depicting the pharaoh as a child receiving blessings from the gods. To the Egyptians, birth was not merely biological. It was cosmic. The child was Horus incarnate. The mother was a living Hathor. The lineage continued. And yet behind the symbolism were ordinary emotions: fear, hope, relief, exhaustion. Queens, like any mother, faced risks. Many likely confided their worries to attendants in whispered moments. They were divine in the eyes of the people, but human in their own hearts. Some pregnancies brought joy. Others brought loss. Some produced strong heirs. Others produced fragile children whose health silently reflected the strain of dynastic inbreeding, though no Egyptian text ever acknowledged this. The emotional weight on a queen must have been tremendous. But Egypt moved on gently, as if carried on the quiet breeze of the Nile. Let's drift a little further. A pharaoh who loved too much, or not at all. Pharaohs had reputations, some passionate, some aloof, some entirely indifferent to romance. Take Ramesses II, for example, often portrayed as a father of countless children, but his love for Nefertari shines through his monuments. He carved lavish poems to her. He built her a temple equal in size to his own, a rare honor. Their relationship, though wrapped in political expectation, appears to have been genuinely warm. Then there's Hatshepsut, who seems to have kept her romantic life extremely private. She focused on administration, building projects, and presenting herself as a legitimate ruler of Egypt. Whether she had lovers is unknown, but her life suggests emotional restraint, or simply priorities far larger than courtship. On the other end is Amenhotep III, whose palace at Malkata was filled with luxury, celebration, music, and foreign brides. He turned romance into diplomacy, and his reign was filled with feasts, festivals, and lavish ceremonies. And then there's Akhenaten, whose emotional world remains a puzzle carved in elegant, elongated limestone. Each king or queen approached love differently. Each carried the weight of tradition in their own way. Each shaped Egypt's story in soft, unique patterns. And through all of it, the Nile flowed, quietly indifferent, washing centuries of secrets into the sand. We've drifted softly from divine myths to the gentle hum of the royal harem, from fertility magic to childbirth, from cosmic unions to the quiet hopes of queens. There is still so much more to explore: seduction rituals, the politics of beauty, royal scandals that unfolded under moonlit colonnades, and the secret lives of the concubines whose names never made it into official history. But for now, let's pause on a riverbank, breathe, and look back at the gentle swirl of stories behind us. Before we drift into part 3, tell me softly in the comments, if you lived in ancient Egypt, do you think you prefer the peaceful life of an ordinary villager or the complicated luxury of the palace? The dawn that followed was not gentle. It crawled over the horizon like a wounded beast, dragging streaks of red behind it. Light that looked less like sunrise and more like spilled wine across the sky. The village of Dunran was awake long before that strange light touched its roofs. Farmers stood silently at their thresholds, staring at the faint smoke still rising from the ruined granary. Children clung to their mothers. Men held tools that could double as weapons, though most knew they would shatter against the steel of the raiders who had struck the night before. And in the center of it all stood Aldrich, cloak torn, bandaged, shoulder throbbing, eyes sharp despite a sleepless night. The elders formed a small circle around him. Their voices rose and fell like troubled wind. "This is the third raid in as many months," muttered Elder Torvin. "They grow bolder. They grow desperate," countered Mara, the herb woman. "Desperation makes monsters of men." No, Aldrich shook his head. Someone is guiding them. Someone who knows these lands better than any wanderer. A hush fell. Everyone knew what he meant, but none dared say it. No raiders from outside the kingdom could navigate Allander's northern forests without a guide. Someone from within. Someone who had betrayed them. The oath renewed. Ira approached him then, still pale, but steadier on her feet than she had been last night when he dragged her from the burning granary. Her hands trembled, though she hid them inside her sleeves. "You need rest, Aldrich," she said softly. "You hardly slept." He offered the faintest smile. There was nothing to wake up for. "You mean there was too much to stay asleep for?" Her retort earned her a tired chuckle, but the smile faded quickly. "You saw them," Aldrich said. "The raiders moved with purpose. They weren't stealing. They were searching." He paused. "For something." Ira's gaze shifted, troubled. "The one who grabbed me." He kept repeating the same phrase. "The hall awakens. Find the keeper." "I don't know what it means." Aldrich did, or at least he suspected. It was a name spoken only in dust-covered tomes and whispered warnings. Stories told to keep children from wandering too far into the old hills. The Whispering Hall of Allander, a ruin, a legend, and also, perhaps, a weapon. Torvin turned to Aldrich. If what Ira says is true, then the hall is no longer just a fireside tale. "If raiders believe it is real," Aldrich replied, "then someone has convinced them. Someone with enough knowledge to twist a legend into truth. And if they find it before we do..." Aldrich's jaw clenched. Then the kingdom's troubles will be far greater than burned grain. The elder swallowed hard and nodded. Then it must be you, Torvin said. You must go north and seek out what hides beneath the ruins. Iris stiffened. No, he can't go alone. You know what lies beyond the river roads. Bandits, the Black Marsh, the Wildwood. Mara laid a calming hand on her shoulder. Child, no one said he would go alone. Aldrich tilted his head. I had not expected volunteers. You won't need volunteers, Iris said firmly. You'll have me. The elders gasped. Aldrich stared. Ira, he said quietly, the journey is dangerous. And after last night... Exactly, she interrupted. Last night taught me something. Terrifying things don't become less terrifying by hiding from them. I can read, something most raiders can't. I know herbs, old lore, symbols. If these men are searching for something from old legends, shouldn't you take someone who can read them? Aldrich hesitated, but she was right, painfully right, and this was not a time for pride. Very well, he murmured. You'll come. Preparing for the road. They left by mid-morning, when enough villagers had offered them supplies. Dry bread, strips of smoked meat, flasks of water, a satchel of Mara's herbs. Aldrich carried his sword in a round shield marked with a fading crest of Olander. Ira wore a warm cloak dyed forest green and carried a satchel nearly as large as she was. They walked along the narrow road that curved northward, toward the towering pines that marked the edge of the wildwood. The silence between them was comfortable for a time. Only when they reached the old stone bridge did Iris speak. I meant to thank you, she said quietly, for last night. Aldrich didn't stop walking. There's no debt between us. There is. More than one, I think. He met her gaze then, steady, unreadable. Ira, I didn't save you out of duty to the village. She blinked. Then why? Because I could not bear the thought of losing anyone else. The words hung between them, soft as dust but heavy as iron. They crossed the bridge in silence. Parting shadows. By midday they reached the marshlands, flat, gray, and strangely quiet. Heavy fog clung low to the ground, curling around their ankles like cold fingers. Ira grimaced. I hate this place. My mother used to say the marsh remembers every foot that enters it. It remembers the ones that never leave, Aldrich replied dryly. She swatted his arm, comforting. They pressed on carefully, keeping to the raised stones that formed a half-forgotten road. The marsh around them bubbled occasionally, as though something beneath the surface stirred. Tell me about the hall, Ira said. Whatever you know. Aldrich studied the mist ahead. The Whispering Hall is older than the kingdom. Some say it was built by the first kings. Others say it was not built at all, that it simply appeared one day in the northern cliffs. And the whispers? Legends say the stones speak to those who enter. Some hear warnings. Others hear promises. And some never return at all. Ira shivered. And the keeper they mentioned? That part one don't know. The stories give many names. Guardian, Watcher, Sleeper. He shook his head. But all versions agree on one thing. The hall does not open for just anyone. So why now? Aldrich didn't answer, because he didn't know. And that frightened him more than he wished to admit. The forest of black pines. By late afternoon they reached the wildwood, the black pines, so named because the bark on every tree was dark as pitch. The canopy soared high, swallowing much of the fading light. Ira paused, staring upward. It feels as though the forest is watching. Aldrich unsheathed his knife. It is... They entered. Birds screamed occasionally in distant branches. The air smelled of sap and something older, muskier, like the breath of a long-sleeping beast. They walked carefully, ears alert. Hours passed. The light dimmed, just as Aldrich lifted his hand to signal they should stop for camp. He froze. So, did she? A twig snapped, not behind them, but in the trees above. Ira whispered, "What was that?" Aldrich didn't answer. He lifted his shield. Another snap, then a soft, rumbling growl from the branches. And then it fell. Something massive, gray-furred, and heavier than any wolf Aldrich had ever seen. It hit the ground between them with an impact that shook the needles from pines. A dire wolf, an ancient breed thought extinct. The beast's yellow eyes locked onto them with terrible hunger. Ira stumbled back. Aldrich stepped forward. The wolf lunged. Aldrich caught the blow on his shield, but the force sent him staggering. The wolf circled, jaws snapping. "Run!" Aldrich shouted. Ira shook her head. "Not without you." The wolf sprang again. Aldrich ducked, slicing upward with his blade, scoring a shallow cut along its flank. The beast howled. Fury ignited and barreled toward Ira. She fumbled for anything at all, and her hand closed around Mara's herb satchel. With trembling fingers, she grabbed the closest pouch and hurled its contents at the wolf's face. A cloud of fine, yellow powder burst in the air. The wolf inhaled and reeled back, sneezing violently, eyes watering. "What was that?" Aldrich gasped. "Firewort pollen," she said breathlessly. "Burns the eyes." Aldrich didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged. This time the blade struck deep. The wolf fell. Panting, Aldrich stepped back. Sweat dripped from his brow. "You saved us." Ira leaned against a tree, shaking. "Not exactly how I intended to use my herbs." Aldrich touched her arm. "You did well." She swallowed. "Next time, let's fight something smaller." He smiled. "Agreed." Nightfall in the pines. They camped near a shallow stream, too exhausted to continue. Aldrich built a fire, while Ira cleaned his cuts with warm water and herbs. The flames cast soft orange light across their faces. "Do you think the raiders are still ahead of us?" she asked. "Without a doubt." "And the hall, is it real, Aldrich?" He watched the fire a long moment. "When I was a boy," he said slowly, "my father brought me north. He pointed to the mountains and told me that some places are older than memory, that the earth itself keeps secrets no man was meant to uncover. And you think the hall is one of them?" "I think," he exhaled, "I think the world is shifting. And whatever sleeps beneath Ollander's cliffs is waking." She wrapped her cloak tighter around her. "Do you ever wish we'd stayed home?" "Every step," he said with a half-smile. "But some duties chase us, Ira, even into the wild." She nodded. Silence settled again, soft and almost peaceful. Almost, because in the far distance, beyond the trees, a faint echo drifted on the wind. A hollow, resonant sound. A rumble, like stones moving, like something opening. Aldrich stood abruptly. That came from the north. Ira rose too, eyes wide. "The hall?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to, because a thunderous, low groan came again. Longer this time, deeper, more deliberate. The sound of ancient doors shifting after centuries of silence. Aldrich exchanged a look with Ira. Whatever they were walking toward, it had just awakened. The path of echoes. They broke camp before dawn, urgency pushing them forward. The forest grew denser, darker, older, as though each step carried them further into a forgotten world. By midday, they reached a narrow gorge where the trees thinned and the land sloped downward into fog. A faint vibration trembled through the stones beneath their feet. "Do you feel that?" Ira whispered. Aldrich nodded. "It's coming from ahead." They descended carefully, gripping roots and jutting rocks as they climbed down the gorge. At the bottom flowed a shallow river, cold, fast-moving, and tinted faintly silver beneath the sunlight. "Strange color," Ira murmured. "It's not the water," Aldrich said, crouching to touch it. "It's the stones underneath." Smooth, polished stones, each etched with faint runes. Runes neither of them recognized. "They're glowing," Ira whispered. "So is the current." Aldrich stood. "This river wasn't like this last time I traveled north." Meaning whatever opened last night is changing the land." They followed the river upstream. Hours passed. The cliffs rose higher around them, narrowing until the path became a single winding trail. The air tasted metallic, charged with strange energy. Then, finally, they saw it. The cliffs of Ollander. The cliffs towered like the walls of a forgotten fortress. Smooth stone, gray and ancient, carved by wind and time. But in the center of the cliff face, something new had appeared. Something impossible. A doorway. Not carved, but revealed, as though the cliff had peeled back, exposing colossal archway of stone covered in spiraling runes. A faint blue light pulsed within the carvings, like a heartbeat. Ira covered her mouth with both hands. Aldrich, it's real. Yes. His voice was barely a whisper. The whispering hall. It's awake. But they were not alone. Shadows moved near the entrance. 3 figures in iron-gray cloaks stood before the ruin, examining the archway. They carried long spears, shields of northern oak, and masks carved from bone. Raiders. Aldrich pulled Ira behind a boulder. You said they were searching, she whispered. But what could raiders want with something like this? Aldrich's expression hardened. They're not acting alone. Someone with knowledge is directing them. Someone who understands a hall. And the keeper they mentioned? He looked up at the glowing runes. I think, he murmured, we're about to find out. If you were standing with Aldrich and Ira at the foot of the newly revealed Whispering Hall, with raiders already investigating its entrance, would you choose to hide and observe, attempt negotiation, or strike first? Comment below what you would do and why. The raiders were too close for comfort. Aldrich's pulse thudded in his ears as he pulled Ira deeper behind the jutting boulder. The whispering wind that curled around the newly open hall carried a scent of old stone, frost, and something metallic, like the taste of blood on a winter morning. Ira swallowed hard. There are 3 of them, maybe more inside the hall. Likely, Aldrich said. These 3 are scouts. The rest are waiting somewhere nearby. The runes pulsing across the archway threw faint blue light over the raiders' bone masks. One of them lifted a hand and pressed his palm against the glowing symbols. The runes brightened. Aldrich stiffened. That's impossible. Only royal blood. He cut himself off before finishing the thought. Ira turned sharply toward him. What do you mean, royal blood? Aldrich, what do you know about this place that you haven't told me? He didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the glowing archway, his expression darkened by a memory he had tried very hard to bury. I'll explain, he whispered. But not here, not while they're opening it further. Ira peered around the stone. They're trying to push the door inward. It won't open that way, Aldrich muttered. The hall doesn't respond to force, only to key markers. He stood slowly. We need to learn what they know and who command them. Ira caught his sleeve. You're not thinking of confronting them. But he already was, and she could see it. The ambush. Aldrich slid from the cover of the boulder, like a shadow melting into the twilight. The 3 raiders remained focused on the runes, speaking in low, clipped syllables of a language Aldrich didn't recognize. He crept behind the closest one, blade drawn. When he struck fast. The first raider collapsed without a sound. The second spun, spear raised, but Ira hurled a handful of firework pollen into his face. He staggered back, coughing and clawing at his eyes. The third raider screamed in alarm. Aldrich cursed. He lunged, blocking the spear thrust meant for Ira. The bone-tipped blade scraped across his shield with a screech. Ira darted behind a pillar of stone, searching her satchel frantically. Aldrich ducked beneath a second swing and slammed the raider backward, knocking him flat. Before the man could rise, Aldrich pressed a knee to his chest and placed the edge of his blade beneath the raider's mask. Talk, he growled. Who sent you? What do you want from the hall? The raider laughed, a dry, hollow laugh. You cannot stop what wakes, Allender born. Aldrich froze. Ira looked sharply toward him. Allender born. Aldrich. Why would they call you that? Aldrich kept his blade steady, but his breath faltered. Tell me who commands you, he demanded. The raider's voice dropped to a whisper. The keeper stirs, and your blood will open the path. Then he spat a mouthful of dark liquid onto the runes beside him. The ground trembled. The raider convulsed and fell still. Ira gasped. What was that? Poison, Aldrich murmured, wiping his blade. Something he keeps in his teeth. Loyal to the last breath. He stood, chest-heaving. They weren't trying to enter, he said quietly. They were trying to awaken it. Ira touched his arm. Aldrich, you need to tell me what this place is. What you are. He closed his eyes. I was going to tell you when we made camp, But I suppose fate has made the choice for me. The bloodlines of Olander. They moved deeper into the shelter of the rock formations. Far enough not to be seen, close enough to observe the glowing archway. Aldrich sat with his back against the cold stone. The runes painted his features in blue light that made him look carved from moonlit marble. My father, he began, used to bring me north once every few years. He would show me ancient stones, ruins, remnants of a kingdom older than the one on any map today. Ira listened silently. He would speak in whispers of the first kings. Not the kings in our history scrolls. Older, those who shaped the north long before the modern line. They were called the Olander. Her eyes widened. The same name as the mountain range. Because the mountains were theirs, Aldrich said. They built temples in the cliffs, cities beneath the rivers, and halls hidden from common eyes. The most powerful among them were said to share a single lineage. And, she whispered, he hesitated. But then, truth mattered now more than pride. My father believed we carried their blood. Ira stared. You mean you're descended from... I don't know, Aldrich snapped softly. Rumors. Stories. Nothing I ever believed. But some places reacted to me. Old stones. Runes. Doors. His gaze drifted to the archway. And now the raiders know it. Ira inhaled sharply. That one raider said your blood would open something. Yes. And that's why they attacked the village? Why they were searching. Yes. Her fingers curled into her cloak. Aldrich, why didn't you tell anyone? Because I barely understand it myself. He shook his head. And because no one should wield the power of old kingdoms. Not raiders, not kings, not me. But someone is trying to claim it. Yes, he said. Someone who knows the legends far better than I do. The whispering door. They approached the archway once more, cautiously. The runes glowed brighter than before, humming with a soft vibration that Ira felt in her bones. It was as though the mountain itself breathed. Can you read them? She whispered. Some, Aldrich admitted. Not enough. He reached out a hand. Wait! Ira grabbed his wrist. What if it reacts to... Her warning came too late. The moment Aldrich's fingers brushed the stone, the runes flared brilliant white. The air cracked like lightning. A deep, resonant boom shook the earth. Ira stumbled back. Aldrich staggered, but the doorway shifted. Stone groaned. The arch widened. And then, a voice, soft, ancient, whispering not in their ears, but in their minds. Blood of the first. The path remembers you. Ira clapped her hands over her ears, even though it did nothing. The whisper vibrated inside her skull, gentle yet overwhelming. Aldrich dropped to one knee, gripping his head. Stop, he gasped. Stop. The whisper faded. Ira rushed to him, heart pounding. Are you hurt? No, his breathing steadied. But the hall recognized me. And that means, she said slowly, it wants to be opened. Aldrich stared at the archway, where the runes now beat like a slow, rhythmic pulse. It means, he whispered, that whatever's inside is not meant for the world outside. He looked at Ira. We can walk away. Right now. Leave the hall shut. Go home. Nothing forces us to open it. Ira shook her head. Aldrich, the raiders will return with more men. If we leave it, they'll force you to open it. Or they'll bleed the whole kingdom dry searching for another way. He looked down. She continued softly. Already too deep in this. We finish it, or others will pay the cost. Aldrich's throat tightened. Gods! She was braver than he had ever given her credit for. He took her hand. Then we ended together. Together, she agreed. They stepped toward the archway. The runes responded, softening in color, shifting from white to a steady, calming blue. The door parted, not with a groan of stone, but with a sigh, as though the hall had been waiting for centuries. Inside the whispering hall, the chamber beyond the entrance stretched wide and circular, lit by a pale glow that didn't seem to come from any visible source. The walls were carved with spiraling patterns, flowing designs that depicted mountains, rivers, and kings with crowns shaped like rising suns. Ira whispered, Aldrich, look. The carvings moved. Not quickly. only subtly, like shadows shifting at the edge of a lantern's reach. The images seemed to ripple, changing as they watched. "This place is alive," she breathed. "Not alive," Aldrich murmured. "Awake." Their footsteps echoed like drops falling into a deep cavern. In the center of the hall stood a single pedestal, stone, cracked with age. Upon it lay a disk made of crystal and metal intertwined, shaped like a sunburst. Aldrich approached slowly. Ira grabbed his sleeve. "Is that wise?" "No," he said softly, "but I've never been wise." He lifted the disk. A soft vibration hummed through the chamber. The murals on the walls froze, and the whispering returned. This time clearer. "Child of the lost line. The keeper dreams no longer." Ira backed toward the entrance. "Aldrich, something's wrong." The ground beneath them trembled. Dust shook from the ceiling. Aldrich clutched the disk. "We triggered something." The whisper deepened. "The keeper wakes." A cold wind spiraled around them, rising like a storm made of shadows. The torches that weren't torches flickered violently. Ira shouted, "We need to leave. Now!" Aldrich turned, but the door was closing. Slowly, deliberately, as though the hall itself refused to let them go. He grabbed Ira's hand and ran. The doorway narrowed. The ground shook. The whisper became a roar. And as they dove through the shrinking gap, Aldrich heard one final sentence echo through his skull. "You cannot flee your blood." They tumbled out onto the dirt outside, just as the stone door slammed shut behind them. Silence fell. The runes faded to darkness. Not gone. Sleeping again. But different now, because something inside was awake. Aftermath. Aldrich lay breathless on the ground, staring at the sky. Ira coughed and pushed herself up. "Well," she gasped, "that was the worst idea we've ever had." He laughed weakly. Possibly. But neither of them truly laughed, because the mountain was still rumbling. Quiet, subtle, but constant. Ira whispered, "Aldrich, what did we wake up?" He didn't answer, because he couldn't. He clutched the sunburst disk, still warm in his hands. Whatever the keeper was, it was real. It was awake, and it was tied to him by blood older than any kingdom. If you suddenly discovered that an ancient ruin recognized your bloodline and awakened a mysterious keeper because of you, would you try to find out the truth of your ancestry? Or would you run from it before it consumes you? Comment your choice and tell me why you choose that path. The mountain did not stop trembling. Not entirely. Not even after Aldrich and Ira had put distance between themselves and the sealed hall. It was a subtle thing, like the low, constant hum of a hive hidden deep beneath the earth. But it stayed with them as they descended the ridge into the thinning afternoon light. Aldrich walked in silence for a long time. He kept his hand pressed to the satchel where the sunburst disk now rested. Ira noticed this, of course. She noticed everything. "Is it still warm?" she asked softly. Aldrich nodded. "Like a stone left in sunlight." "And the tremor we felt, that's from the disk?" "No," his jaw tightened. "It's from the hall." Ira studied him carefully. "You heard it again, didn't you?" He inhaled slowly, only faintly, a whisper under wind. "Is it speaking to you?" "I don't know. Maybe." He paused, rubbing at his temple. "It's like hearing a voice through layers of water. You can't make out words, but you know you're being called." Ira shivered faintly. "We woke something very old." "Yes," Aldrich murmured, "and something that was not meant to be disturbed." They kept walking, descending along the deer paths that wound between crags of granite and wind-scraped brush. The horizon glowed with the dying colors of sunset, smudges of orange and violet sliding into the blue shadow of night. The world looked peaceful, serene, but the weight of the awakened hall pressed against Aldrich's thoughts like an unseen hand. He could feel it watching, not maliciously, not even consciously, like something ancient, stretching after a long sleep, not yet aware of its own strength. Nightfall in the pines. They reached a sheltered cluster of pines before darkness fully swallowed the sky. Ira sank onto a fallen log and exhaled long and slow. "We camp here." Aldrich nodded silently. He set down his pack, reached for the flint, and began striking sparks toward a small pile of kindling. Ira watched the motions. He performed them with the ease of habit. But tonight his movements were slower, more deliberate. When the fire finally crackled to life, she sat beside him, letting the warmth soak into her chilled fingers. "Aldrich," she whispered after a long stretch of silence, "what do you think the keeper is?" He kept his eyes on the fire. "In the stories my father told, the first kings built guardians, creatures of stone and light, spirits bound to halls and temples. They weren't alive in the way we understand, but they weren't dead either. They existed to protect secrets. And the keeper was one of those? Maybe." Aldrich shook his head. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Legends change as they're retold. Kings become giants. Giants become demons. Demons become myths. I don't know what we've woken. Ira hugged her knees. "The raiders do." "Yes," he admitted. "And that's what frightens me more than the keeper itself." Ira leaned back, staring at the thick canopy overhead. Stars were beginning to flicker into view. Through the gaps in the branches, she could see the veins of the milky river, white dust scattered across the black canvas of night. She sighed. "You know, there's a part of me that's curious." Aldrich raised an eyebrow. "Curious? After everything we saw?" "Of course," she murmured, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "We stumbled into a legend older than recorded history, a place that responds to your blood, a sleeping guardian, a disc that glows for you. If your father told you fragments, I want the whole story." He stared into the fire for several heartbeats. "It began with a sword," he said finally. "Aldrich's burden." Ira shifted, listening intently. "My earliest memory," Aldrich began, his voice soft and distant, "is of my father holding a blade unlike any other in our armory. It was etched with sigils no one could decipher. The metal shimmered like starlight on water. He kept it hidden in a chest, wrapped in linen, guarded like a treasure." Ira frowned. "Did he ever tell you where he got it?" "No, only that it was passed down to the firstborn sons of my line." Aldrich's fingers twitched unconsciously toward his pack, where the disc now lay. "He said it came from the Allender, the ancient kings who ruled before memory." "And you believe him?" "Of course not." He let out a soft, tired chuckle. "I thought he was embellishing old folk tales." But then he looked toward the trees, as if expecting ghosts to drift between the trunks. "When I was 13, the sword glowed for me." Ira nearly dropped her cloak. It glowed, just faintly, like moonlight reflected on ice. I thought it was a trick of the eye, but my father felt his knees. He pressed his forehead to the ground and whispered, "The line continues." Aldrich exhaled. I had no idea what that meant. I still don't. Ira leaned closer. "So when the runes reacted to you today..." He nodded. It felt the same. She rested a hand on his arm. "Aldrich, this isn't your fault." He stared at the crackling fire. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked vulnerable, not broken, just tired in a way that had nothing to do with the journey. "I wish I could believe that," he murmured. The raider's signal. A sudden pulse of distant orange flickered through the trees. Iris stiffened. "A fire? Not natural," Aldrich said, rising instantly. "Look at the height of the flames. Too tall, too bright." She stood beside him and squinted into the forest. A column of fire licked upward somewhere beyond the ridge. "That's at least a league away," she whispered. "Who would build a fire that large?" Aldrich's jaw hardened. "Someone trying to send a signal." Ira's breath hitched. "The raiders..." He nodded grimly. "They want reinforcements. They know the hall is active. They know I opened it. Then they'll come for you. They will," Aldrich said quietly, "and they won't stop." The mountain tremor deepened for a brief moment. As if responding, Ira glanced toward the ridge. "The keeper is awake, and the raiders know that too." Aldrich forced a slow breath. "We have two choices. We run, as far and fast as possible. Or," his eyes shifted toward the satchel holding the disc, "we find out what the keeper actually wants." Ira shook her head sharply. "How?" "The hall threw us out, literally. And the raiders will kill us before we get close again. Unless," Aldrich said quietly, "we use the disc. Maybe it isn't simply a key. Maybe it's a guide. The mountain rumbled faintly once more like agreement. Ira crossed her arms. So what are you suggesting? That we follow where it leads. Her mouth fell open. Aldrich, we aren't following a glowing ancient relic like a pair of moths chasing a torch. It may be our only advantage, he replied, voice steady. The raiders want this. They want the hall, the keeper, the bloodline. If we understand it first, maybe we can stop them. Ira groaned into her hands. Gods preserve me. This is madness. Yes, Aldrich said softly, but it's ours. The disc awakens. He drew the satchel into his lap and carefully unwrapped the sunburst disc. The surface shimmered faintly even without touching it. Do you hear anything? Ira whispered. No, Aldrich held the disc in both hands. But I feel something like the tug of a tide. The disc pulsed. Once, twice. A low, melodic hum filled the clearing. Not loud, but resonant, like the note of a stringed instrument played from beneath the ground itself. The fire shivered. Pine needles on the forest floor swirled in faint circles. Ira stumbled back. Aldrich. I'm fine, he said, though sweat beaded at his brow. The hum deepened. A faint glow shot outward from the disc, forming a thin ribbon of light that drifted across the clearing and disappeared between the trees. Ira gaped. What was that? A direction, Aldrich murmured. You can't be serious. It wants us to follow that. He didn't answer. The disc pulsed again, insistent now. Ira dragged a hand over her face. This can't be real. Aldrich gave her a weary smile. Neither can waking a centuries-old guardian in a stone chamber. Yet here we are. She stared at him for a long, slow moment, then sighed heavily. Fine, but if this gets us killed, I'm haunting you. I'd expect nothing less. The path of echoes. They packed their gear swiftly. Aldrich tucked the disc away again, but even from within the satchel, it emitted a faint rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. They followed the ribbon of light's direction into the pine forest. The air was crisp. Silence pressed close around them, broken only by the crunch of needles beneath their boots. The forest felt older here, taller trunks, deeper shadows, thicker moss clinging to stone. Ira whispered, Do you think the keeper sees us? Aldrich shook his head. I don't know if it sees at all. It feels more like sensing, like the hall knew I existed before I ever touched it. That's not comforting. No, they continued downward. The path sloped sharply, the trees thinning until they reached a narrow gorge carved by an ancient river. A faint blue shimmer glowed along the rocks, residual light from the ribbon they had followed. Ira knelt beside a stone that bore a faint carving. Aldrich, it's the same symbol from the hall. He crouched beside her. The Allender marked this place. The disc pulsed in agreement. Aldrich exhaled. We're close. Ira glanced nervously at the sky. The large signal fire still flickered on the distant ridge. We're not alone out here, she murmured. No, Aldrich agreed quietly. And the raiders won't be far behind. The hidden basin. They rounded the bend in the gorge and froze. A basin opened before them. A wide, circular hollow filled with silver grass that shimmered like moonlit frost. At the center of the basin stood a single standing stone, etched with spiraling runes. Ira whispered, It looks like a shrine. Aldrich didn't respond. He stepped forward, drawn as though pulled by invisible strings. The disc thrummed in the satchel like a beating drum. Ira grabbed his cloak. Aldrich, wait. But he was already walking. He approached the standing stone. The tremor beneath the mountain intensified. The air thickened. Aldrich touched the stone, and the world shifted. The vision of the first king. Ira screamed, but her voice seemed distant, fading like candlelight in a deep tunnel. Aldrich's vision blurred. The basin dissolved. The night dissolved. He stood in a vast hall, one far larger and grander than the whispering hall they had entered. Golden banners hung from arches that scraped the sky. Columns of white stone glowed faintly. Figures surrounded him, tall, robed. Their eyes were pale like frost. One stepped forward, a king with a crown of woven sunlight. Child of our line, the king said, voice echoing through Aldrich's bones. The keeper stirs because your blood has touched the hall once more. Aldrich opened his mouth, but no words came. The king gestured toward a massive stone door carved with the same somber symbol as a disc. When the last of our line fell, the king said, "We sealed the keeper, not to protect ourselves, but to protect the world from what our power had become." Aldrich felt cold. The king's eyes dimmed with something that looked like regret. Power breeds arrogance. Arrogance breeds ruin. And the keeper was our greatest mistake. The hall darkened. Aldrich staggered back. "What is the keeper?" he managed. The king's answer was barely a whisper. "Our legacy. Our weapon. Our doom." A blinding light filled the hall, and Aldrich fell. The awakening. He collapsed onto the silver grass of the basin. Ira knelt beside him, shaking his shoulders. Aldrich, can you hear me?" His chest heaved. His eyes fluttered open. The tremor beneath the mountain no longer felt distant. It felt close. Too close. Ira saw the fear in his expression. "What happened?" He swallowed hard. "The keeper isn't a guardian." Ira froze. "Then what is it?" Aldrich looked toward the ridge where the raiders' signal fire burned. "It's a weapon," he whispered. "One capable of destroying entire kingdoms." The mountain groaned. The earth shook violently beneath their feet. Ira grabbed his hand. "What do we do?" Aldrich pulled himself up, breast sharp. "We run." "But the disc." "It can come with us," he said. "But the keeper can't." Ira stared at him. "You intend to outrun something that's been asleep for centuries?" He turned toward the trembling earth. "No," he said quietly. "I intend to stop the raiders from controlling it." The mountain roared. The basin shook. Trees splintered above them. Aldrich grabbed Ira's hand, and they ran. If you uncovered a vision revealing that an ancient keeper was not a protector, but a kingdom-destroying weapon, would you try to seal it again, or use it to protect your people, even if it meant risking everything? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious what you choose. And now, return to the Pharaohs themselves. Let's drift back to the Nile, back to the golden sunlight sliding over temple walls, back to the gentle hum of oars pushing to the water, back to a world where kings did not simply reign. They performed. They embodied. They acted out the cosmos in all its orderly and occasionally bewildering intimacy. Because in Egypt, a pharaoh wasn't just a man. He was a living axis between earth and sky, charged with duties that were sometimes spiritual, sometimes political, and occasionally, let's just say, deeply symbolic in ways that probably made court scribes stare at the floor very intently. You may remember how earlier we drifted through the dynastic anxieties of royalty in general, the strange little habits of kings who feared losing control, and the lengths elites across the world went to in order to convince everyone that their bloodlines were special. Egypt was no exception. In fact, Egypt perfected it. They didn't just have royal customs. They had divine obligations, ritual obligations, symbolic obligations involving fertility, creation, and the maintenance of cosmic balance. And naturally, these obligations came with their own set of unusually intimate expectations. Now, it's important to settle in and approach this gently. We're not drifting into anything graphic. Egyptian sexuality, especially in the royal household, wasn't treated like a private matter. It was a cosmic metaphor, a universe-making mechanism. And the pharaoh stood right at the center of it, somewhat like a slightly overworked celestial employee whose job description only got longer with each dynasty. You can almost imagine an ancient administrator approaching the king with a stack of papyri saying, "Great one, lord of the two lands. Also, if you have a moment, the temple requires you to reenact the birth of the cosmos again this afternoon." Yes, again. No, unfortunately, it cannot be delegated. But before we examine any single ritual, let's drift a bit deeper into the Egyptian worldview, because otherwise these customs would seem bizarre for bizarre's sake. Egyptian religion revolved around cycles of creation, everything meaningful repeated. Every day the sun rose because the gods performed the same divine patterns, and every year the Nile flooded because the same cosmic drama unfolded eternally. And the king, whether he liked it or not, had to mirror those dramas in the human world. If the gods created the world through union, well, the king had to echo that symbolically. If a goddess bestowed fertility through sacred touch, well, The king had participated in that, too, ideally with dignity, though history suggests this was occasionally in short supply. One of the most quietly fascinating aspects of pharaonic ritual life was the emphasis on the king as a stand-in for Horus, the great sky god, or for Osiris, the resurrected lord of the dead, depending on the occasion. This dual identity didn't exactly make things simpler. If anything, it complicated the royal calendar significantly. One day he was required to represent the virile, ever-youthful Horus. The next he was reenacting the rejuvenation of Osiris, who, to put it bluntly, had a very difficult time with bodily wholeness in mythology, particularly one part him, which Isis supposedly reassembled with great dedication, patience, and one imagines more emotional resilience than most people could muster. Because of these mythological frameworks, the pharaoh's intimate life, or rather, the rituals symbolizing aspects of it, were considered essential for maintaining the balance of creation itself. Now, this didn't mean the pharaoh was constantly performing literal acts. In many cases, these were symbolic motions, offerings, or ritual gestures. However, even symbolic acts can become quite elaborate. Temples like Karnak and Luxor were built to stage these cosmic reenactments, meaning that portions of the king's spiritual duties would take place in secluded sanctuaries. The Egyptian priests recorded these events on walls and in ritual manuals, often with a kind of composed formality that suggests everyone was pretending this was all completely normal. Take, for instance, the Hebsed festival, one of the grandest royal rituals. Traditionally performed after 30 years of rule. You'd think 30 years of ruling Egypt would be enough of a commitment. But no, the king also needed to ritually prove his vitality. Now, this didn't include anything inappropriate. It was more about demonstrating strength and fertility, symbolically. But the underlying implication lingered. The king had to show he still possessed a vigor to uphold the cosmos. In a society where kingship was tied to the fertility of the land, this vitality wasn't just a personal matter. If the king appeared weak, the Nile might falter, the crops might fail, and everyone would have a very bad day. So the festival wasn't merely ceremonial. It was a full-scale cosmic performance review, complete with, "Are you still capable of sustaining the universe? Yes? Splendid. Please jog around the courtyard now." Yet despite the solemnity, the Hebsed hints at the broader Egyptian preoccupation with royal fertility, a theme that appears again and again in more specific rituals. Some rituals were tied to the goddess Hathor, the divine consort, mother, and embodiment of love, joy, and intoxication. In certain ceremonies, the king received her blessings in ways that symbolized fertility and rejuvenation. None of these were explicit, of course. The Egyptians conveyed them through metaphor and sacred iconography. But the meaning was unmistakable. Hathor energized the king's potency, which in turn energized the land. Another fascinating custom concerns the god Min, the deity of fertility and reproduction. Min's festivals were enthusiastic affairs, to put it gently, and involved public celebrations where priests carried his cult statue, offerings were presented, and vegetation was displayed to symbolize the flourishing of life. The pharaoh led these rites. Again, there was nothing erotic in the literal sense, but Min's iconography, let's say, required the Egyptians to maintain a very straight face. The king's participation signaled that he embodied the force of life itself, which meant he needed to project an almost supernatural fertility, even if he'd spent the previous night simply trying to get paperwork approved in the palace. But perhaps the most discussed and often misunderstood of all Egyptian royal customs is the practice of sibling marriage. Now, it's crucial to keep this grounded in historical reality. Egyptian sibling marriage wasn't driven by romantic desires. It was a political mechanism, a dynastic tool, and a symbolic echo of divine mythology. The gods married their siblings because they were eternal, perfect beings whose relationships existed outside human norms. Pharaohs, eager to portray themselves as living gods, copied the structure. A king marrying his sister declared, "We are like Osiris and Isis. Our union ensures the order of the world." Did this produce some challenging family dynamics? Almost certainly. Did it produce conversations in which royal siblings tried to casually accept that their marriage was mainly symbolic and politically necessary? Probably. But it also ensured that power remained within an extremely narrow bloodline, one that court officials guarded obsessively. If the king married outside his immediate family, the symbolic link to the gods weakened. If he married within, the line remained pure, at least according to Egyptian ideology. It was less about intimacy and more about theology, though one imagines future generations had thoughts about the long-term genetic consequences. And then there's a coronation ritual involving Mut, the divine mother goddess. Some texts describe the king receiving her heavenly embrace, a symbolic gesture in which the goddess conferred sovereignty upon him. Priests sometimes reenacted these rituals on the king's behalf, interpreting divine affection in ways that blended theology with the faint suggestion that everyone involved was silently hoping the ceremony would be brief. Even the Nile played a role in royal fertility symbolism. The floodwaters represented Isis's tears and Osiris's renewal. So in some festivals, the king symbolically contributed to the river's rejuvenation. Again, symbolic, not literal. Egyptian religion operated on metaphor, the kind of metaphor that took itself very seriously and required the pharaoh to demonstrate that his body, his presence, and his symbolic actions could maintain cosmic order. One of the most peculiar rituals often mentioned, sometimes exaggerated in modern retellings, is the so-called self-renewal rite. Some later Greek writers, not always reliable, claimed pharaohs participated in rituals meant to echo divine acts of creation. These accounts are likely distortions, perhaps based on misunderstandings of temple symbolism or fertility rites involving offerings. Egyptian priests weren't exactly handing out detailed explanations to foreigners, so misunderstandings were inevitable. Still, the idea that a pharaoh was responsible for ritually reenacting cosmic creation in a very personal way lingered in the Greek imagination. Whether or not this literally occurred, its symbolic meaning was potent. Creation was continuous, and the king was a human vessel through which it persisted. That's the thing about Egyptian royal customs. They weren't scandalous to the Egyptians. They weren't even particularly unusual. They were sacred. And so when you hear that a pharaoh married his sister, or that he participated in fertility rituals, or that he reenacted divine unions, you're not encountering salacious behavior. You're encountering a worldview in which the king had to reflect the cosmos itself. If the gods performed certain acts to generate order, the king mirrored those acts through carefully controlled rituals. It was theology, not passion. Symbolism, not indulgence. And yet, while the Egyptians were utterly sincere about this, we, many centuries later, can't help but notice the faintly surreal nature of it all. Imagine being a scribe, tasked with explaining to new palace attendants that, yes, the king will be symbolically uniting with goddess today. And no, you definitely should not ask questions. Or imagine being a young prince, raised to believe that divine siblings married because the universe required it, and therefore you might need to do the same someday. It takes a certain level of cosmic patience to accept all this without raising an eyebrow. But that was Egypt. Order, stability, and cosmic renewal required certain performances, certain unions, certain reenactments. And the pharaoh, whether he was enthusiastic or privately exhausted, had to fulfill them all. He was a bridge between heaven and earth, the eternal caretaker creation, and occasionally, the human participant in rituals that involved layers upon layers of symbolic intimacy. As we drift toward the next part, let me gently ask, if you had lived in ancient Egypt, would you have wanted to carry the burden of performing these cosmic duties? Or would you have politely declined and chosen a quieter life along the riverbank? Tell me in the comments after you wake up. So, drifting onward from those cosmic duties a pharaoh was expected to shoulder, we find ourselves moving deeper into the quiet heart of the royal household, a place that looks serene from the outside, but inside contains its own labyrinth of expectations, obligations, symbols, and occasionally baffling relational arrangements. Ancient Egypt liked everything to appear orderly, even when the underlying dynamics were complicated, to say the least, especially when it came to royal intimacy, lineage, fertility ceremonies, and the many myths that hovered over the palace like a polite but insistent cloud reminding everyone of their duties. And now that we return firmly to Egypt, we can settle in fully and explore how these customs shaped not only the pharaoh, but also the queens, royal sisters, temple priestesses, and even the princesses destined for lives that were sometimes honored, sometimes claustrophobic, and always symbolic. Because Egypt wasn't just a monarchy, it was a theological machine, and the people inside it often found themselves serving as gears, each turning in a very specific direction whether they felt like it or not. One of the most quietly fascinating aspects of Egyptian royal life was the way women held both immense power and immense limitation at the same time. The great royal wife, for instance, held ritual authority as the earthly counterpart to Hathor or Isis. She had political influence, religious responsibilities, and a role in state propaganda. Yet her personal life was shaped by the same dynastic pressures that shaped the kings, including sibling marriage, ritual unions, and, in certain periods, expectations that she maintain a symbolic connection to divine fertility. If the king had to appear rejuvenated, she had to appear cosmically harmonious. That's quite a lot for someone who probably would have preferred a nap. Take Queen Amos Nefertari, one of the most revered royal women in Egyptian history. She held religious titles so powerful that later generations worshipped her as a goddess. But even she moved within the confines of royal custom. Her marriage to her brother, Pharaoh Amos I, wasn't unusual. It reflected the ideology that royalty was a continuation of divine mythology. Osiris and Isis, Shu and Tefnut, brothers and sisters uniting to preserve the spiritual pattern of creation. If the gods did it, the logic went, then the royal family had to mirror it, even if it created situations that modern people find understandably complicated. And if sibling marriage wasn't enough to keep things symbolically tidy, there were even more intricate expectations around producing heirs. The king ideally produced children with his great royal wife, but also with other consorts who represented additional divine aspects. These women weren't concubines in a casual sense. They were embodiments of sacred roles. Their union with the king symbolized different divine attributes needed for cosmic balance, which means that in a palace with multiple consorts, each one carried a ritual purpose, a celestial assignment. It was less a royal harem and more a living mythological diagram, one that, for better or worse, came with a significant amount of personal pressure. The princesses of the royal household also found themselves shaped by ritual expectations. Some were married to their fathers, uncles, or brothers, not for personal desire, but for the preservation of divine lineage. It wasn't romantic, and it wasn't considered scandalous. It was simply the maintenance of cosmic order. A princess might be 6 years old when court officials began referring to her future symbolic role, which mostly meant she was expected to represent a goddess, and eventually enter a ritual marriage. Her life wasn't her own, but to the Egyptians, it was noble and necessary. The modern world reads these arrangements through a very different moral lens, of course, and rightly so. But within ancient Egyptian culture, it was sacred duty, cosmological responsibility, and the continuation of a divine story. Even within these expectations, though, some royal women carved out unexpected independence. Hatshepsut, famously, declared herself king, not queen, not regent, not co-ruler, but king, complete with all masculine titles. She didn't do this out of personal whim. She did it because the role of king, in Egyptian religious ideology, was too important to leave vacant or weakened. The cosmos required a pharaoh, and so she became one. She participated in fertility symbolism, received the blessings of gods like Ammonius, and in temple reliefs, she was shown receiving divine rejuvenation just as male kings did. Of course, the scribes also included polite artistic adjustments. When depicting her in masculine rituals, they quietly gave her a smooth, idealized face and a symbolic beard, as though hoping no one would ask too many questions. But perhaps the most fascinating period, and one that truly highlights the unusual intersections of religion, intimacy, and royal duty, is the Amarna era ruled by Akhenaten, his famous great royal wife Nefertiti, and their exceptionally complicated family. Akhenaten reshaped the religious landscape of Egypt dramatically. He shifted worship away from the traditional gods and toward the Aten, the sun disk, creating a religion that was both revolutionary and deeply disruptive. And in doing so, he also reshaped the symbolic roles of royal intimacy. In traditional religion, the king embodied Horus, and the queen represented Hathor or Isis. Their union was cosmically reinforcing. But under Akhenaten, the royal family became a living trinity. The Aten, Akhenaten, and Nefertiti. Their children were divine emanations. Their interactions, whether in public reliefs or ritual spaces, were infused with symbolic tenderness. Not romantic tenderness, but cosmological tenderness. Scenes of Akhenaten and Nefertiti touching noses, holding their children, or sitting with exaggerated affection weren't meant to depict domestic warmth. They were illustrating the flow of divine energy. Artists exaggerated their gestures because these gestures were metaphors for the Aten's love shining onto the world. But when you look at those released today, you can almost hear the palace staff whispering. The king wishes another portrait of him, and the queen holding hands beneath the rays of the sun disk. And the sculptor sighing softly, already reaching for fresh limestone. Akhenaten's daughters also had ritual responsibilities. They were shown receiving the rays of the Aten just as their parents did, suggesting they were essential components of religious symbolism. Some scholars believe their status created expectations of dynastic marriages that mirrored older traditions. Others suggest Akhenaten's reforms disrupted these arrangements. Either way, the family functioned less like a private household and more like a living icon, endlessly performing symbolic closeness for religious purposes. And then there's the matter of the divine birth scenes, perhaps the most curious component of royal sexual symbolism. These reliefs show a goddess, often Isis, sometimes Hathor, occasionally Mut, choosing the queen as the vessel through which a divine ruler will be born. The god Ammonius or another deity approaches the queen, bestows blessings, and she conceives a future king. Symbolically, this affirmed that the pharaoh wasn't merely human. He was fathered by God. The entire scene was, again, symbolic, but the imagery was powerful. It declared that the king's legitimacy came not from genealogy alone, but from divine selection. To modern viewers, the imagery might seem unusual, but to an Egyptian audience, it was both reassuring and familiar. They knew the gods could take human form. They knew the pharaoh embodied divine spirit. A queen selected by a god to bear a king was simply how the universe maintained itself. The royal family lived in a world where divine involvement was constant, expected, and occasionally very elaborate. But not all unusual customs revolve around marriage or divine birth. Some were tied directly to the agricultural cycles of Egypt. The land's fertility, and therefore the people's survival, depended on rituals that mirror creation. In certain festivals, the pharaoh offered symbols of fertility to the gods: grains, water, sacred oils, and sometimes representations of bodily fluids carved into stone or depicted in symbolic form. Temples stored these objects with reverence. The priests handled them with the same care they gave to holy relics. It wasn't the substance itself that mattered. It was what it represented. The king was offering the essence of life back to the gods, so they would renew Egypt in return. Even royal funerary practices contained echoes of intimate symbolism. The Osiris myth, in which Isis resurrected her husband, influenced the rituals surrounding the death of a king. Priests enacted symbolic gestures to restore the vitality of the deceased ruler, ensuring he could journey into the afterlife as a fully complete being. The rituals weren't physical acts. They were carefully controlled ceremonies meant to echo the mythology. But the symbolism underlying them, once again, reveals how deeply Egyptian religion intertwined cosmic creation with royal identity. Throughout all of this, the sibling marriages, the divine unions, the fertility symbols, the cosmic reenactments, the Egyptians remained utterly sincere. To them, these rituals weren't strange. They were sacred. They kept the universe in balance. They preserved the Nile's rhythm, the rising of the sun, the prosperity of the land. And so the pharaoh performed his duties. The queen embraced her role. The priesthood facilitated it all with composure that must have required extraordinary focus. As we drift gently toward the next part, let me leave you with a quiet question, the kind that lingers softly in the background. If you were a royal in ancient Egypt, would you have embraced these symbolic, cosmic duties, or quietly wish to slip away into a simpler life, free from the expectations of the gods? Let me know in the comments when you wake. Let's drift onward, still floating inside the drowsy half-light of late dynastic Egypt, right where we left off in part 7, deep in that world where royal bodies were not just bodies, but symbols, contracts, promises, and sometimes unfortunate puzzles the priests tried much too hard to interpret. By now, the pattern is familiar. Nearly everything had a ritual explanation, even when the explanation sounded suspiciously like someone making it up on the spot, because they didn't want to admit the pharaoh had simply done something odd on his own. We were talking about the priestly interpretation machines, the ones who could take any royal habit, no matter how personal, and inflate it into a cosmic argument about the sun, the Nile, and the afterlife. This was especially true as the late period rolled in, bringing waves of foreign rule, political tilts, and dynasties that sometimes changed faster than the Nile flood. Whenever things became unstable, the priesthood tended to double down. And by double down, I mean they sometimes took perfectly normal practices of royal family life and framed them as grand reenactments of myth, even when the myths in question had already been stretched quite thin. Naturally, they insisted all of it was ancient tradition. Naturally, much of it was not. The declining centuries of pharaonic rule brought more of this ritual reinterpretation than perhaps any period before it. It was as if Egypt was gripping its identity with both hands, clinging harder as everything else slipped away. Territory, wealth, even political autonomy. And so, in the anxious atmosphere of these later dynasties, royal sexuality, symbolic, political, or simply domestic, became even more scrutinized, analyzed, and mythologized. One of the more curious developments was the increased emphasis on purity roles within the palace. Pharaohs had always been considered semi-divine, of course, but by the late period their bodies were treated almost like rare temple relics. Anything involving reproduction became symbol-heavy, priest-approved, and utterly wrapped in ceremony. Even the selection of royal wives shifted tone. Instead of broad aristocratic marriages, the priesthood pushed the idea of ritual suitability. That meant favoring women who embodied certain goddess-like traits, Hathoric beauty, Isis-like devotion, and occasionally the rather vague quality of pleasing the gods, which conveniently could be assigned almost anyone a priest liked. This doesn't mean the pharaohs themselves lived in some kind of constant ritual bubble. They were human and quite capable of making mundane decisions. But the official interpretation of their choices tended to get dressed up in religious justification. For example, if a pharaoh took multiple wives, which was not unusual, the priesthood might explain it as aligning the palace with multiple goddesses for cosmic balance. If he favored one over another, it was said she more fully represented the true consort of Horus. If he favored several equally, well, that required more elaborate reasoning, but the priests would still find a way. They always found a way. The irony, of course, is that many of these men were not particularly spiritual in their private lives. Some were pragmatic, some quietly indifferent, and a few, as surviving letters suggest, were more interested in courtly entertainment than cosmic destiny. Yet the state still draped their personal choices in mythic cloth. It created a strange dissonance, a normal human ruler living inside a carefully curated divine biography, with the priesthood editing the margins whenever necessary. During these same centuries, the symbolic duties of royal women expanded. Queens were increasingly cast in ritual roles, embodiments of fertility, renewal, and the generational heartbeat of Egypt. Their marriages, pregnancies, and even daily routines were framed as echoes of goddess narratives. A queen bathing was likened to Hathor preparing the world for joy. A queen giving birth was Isis restoring Egypt's future. Even the quieter, domestic moments, nursing, advising, resting, were framed as sacred acts. It was flattering in theory, though perhaps a bit overwhelming in practice. But this symbolic glorification came with a downside: expectations, heavy ones. If a royal marriage did not produce an heir quickly, people whispered that the cosmic balance was off. If the pharaoh showed too little interest in his official wives, it became a matter of ritual concern. A surprisingly large number of temple texts from this era concern the renewal of royal potency, a delicate phrase that scholars politely translate as rituals to symbolically maintain the king's generative power. We can safely assume many of these texts were written by priests who were deeply invested in keeping up appearances. After all, a weakened or disengaged pharaoh threatened the narrative they depended on. Some kings embraced elaborate rituals. Others tolerated them with the weary patience of someone who understands the political usefulness of being ceremonially impressive. But a few found the whole system exhausting. One particularly world-weary pharaoh, whose name we'll leave unmentioned for sake of keeping this relaxed, once wrote that he felt burdened by the eyes of heaven and earth, a poetic way of saying that everyone, mortal and divine, expected far too much of him. It seems even kings suffer from overworked schedules and too many performance requirements. Meanwhile, foreign rulers who inherited the Egyptian throne, Persians, Greeks, even a few opportunistic warlords, found themselves pushed into these ritual expectations whether they liked it or not. The priesthood insisted that any legitimate ruler must adopt certain symbolic behaviors. This included taking on ceremonial spouses, participating in fertility-themed festivals, and showing the proper reverence to Hathor, Isis, and Mut, each with their associated roles in marriage, motherhood, and cosmic balance. Imagine a Macedonian general, grizzled and entirely uninterested in mysticism, suddenly being told he must portray himself as the earthly counterpart Horus, maintain symbolic harmony through marriage, and uphold traditions he had never heard of until last week. The awkwardness must have been remarkable, and yet many complied because to rule Egypt effectively, one had to play the part. By the Ptolemaic period, the ritual emphasis only grew more ornate. The Greek rulers, particularly the early ones, tried very hard to merge Greek and Egyptian traditions that included adapting their marriages, or at least the public presentation of their marriages, to match Egyptian divine models. The Ptolemies famously married siblings, a tradition they insisted was based on the marriage of Isis and Osiris. To their Greek subjects, it seemed eccentric. To the Egyptians, it seemed familiar. And to the modern world, it seems like yet another dynastic attempt to solve political problems through questionable family decisions. Of course, much of this divine model talk was political theater. Even Cleopatra VII, whose image is so often dramatized, understood that the symbolism was strategic. She used the language of sacred union, fertility, and goddess-like identity to strengthen her authority. When she aligned herself with Isis, it wasn't because she believed herself a literal goddess, but because it reinforced her status in the eyes of her Egyptian subjects. She was playing the same game her predecessors had played for centuries, but with more finesse. Still, the palace rituals of the Ptolemaic era did have an unusual mixture of Greek and Egyptian elements. Greek philosophy mingled with Egyptian cosmology. Egyptian priesthoods worked alongside Greek courtiers. Symbolic marriage roles were framed in ways that felt familiar to Egyptians, while being intellectually justified by clever Greek scholars who were very good at retrofitting myths into neat academic explanations. It was a cultural blending that sometimes worked brilliantly, and other times made everyone involved a little confused. Even so, the symbolic meaning of royal intimacy remained essentially Egyptian, tied to renewal, cosmic balance, fertility, and the ongoing story of divine union. It didn't matter whether the ruler came from Thebes, Persia, or Macedon. The symbolic expectations remained the same. The pharaoh or king or co-ruler was part of the cosmic cycle. His relationships weren't fully private matters. They were treated as essential components of the world's stability. And yet, one of the recurring truths of these later centuries is that the pharaohs themselves were increasingly mortal in the political sense. They were no longer unquestioned divine rulers. They shared power with foreign overlords, generals, or complex bureaucracies. Their rituals remained sacred, but their actual influence fluctuated. It created a subtle tension in the symbolism. The body of the king was still treated as divine, even as his political power shrank. The rituals grew larger, even as the throne grew weaker. This contrast, magnificent symbolic expectations placed on rulers who were sometimes little more than ceremonial figureheads, offers a calm, almost melancholy insight into the end of pharaonic culture. The rituals surrounding royal marriage and symbolic reproduction continued because they were comforting, because they provided continuity, and because they represented an identity Egypt refused to let fade. As we drift further into the Ptolemaic twilight, we see this paradox more clearly. The symbolism around royal relationships became louder. Grand festivals, dramatic processions, elaborate temple scenes, while the realities of rule grew more precarious. The priests were performing cultural preservation. The kings were performing legitimacy. And the public, likely tired from the political upheavals of the time, may have simply enjoyed the consistency of tradition, regardless of how complicated the backstage politics had become. In the quiet way history often works, the ritual symbolism outlasted the rulers themselves. When Rome finally swallowed Egypt, the divine marriage ceremonies and cosmic explanations faded, but not instantly. Some traditions lived on quietly, embedded in temples long after the last native priests whispered their final hymns. And so, as we gently close this segment, we can see how the late period and Ptolemaic age continued the ancient pattern. Royal relationships were never purely personal, never fully intimate, never entirely private. They were mythic reenactments, political tools, and symbolic performances all at once. A pharaoh could not simply marry. He had to fulfill the role of Horus. A queen could not simply become pregnant. She had to channel the renewal of Egypt itself. Their lives were ceremonies layered atop everyday humanity, a combination at once fascinating, exhausting, and profoundly revealing. Now, before we drift onward to the next section, here's a quiet engagement question for you to mull over. If you were a ruler in this era, would you find all these ritual expectations comforting or overwhelming? Tell me in the comments. Quietly, of course. Let's drift back into the dim lantern glow of Egypt's long twilight, where rituals lingered even after the world around them had begun to fray. In Part 8, we wander among the late period and the Ptolemaic courts, watching the priesthood weave layer upon layer of symbolism around royal marriages, fertility rites, and the strange expectation that the ruler's most private life somehow kept the cosmos from wobbling off its axis. Now, in Part 9, we stay in that world, but let the focus drift back to the heart of our theme, the unusual, often bewildering sexual and reproductive customs that pharaohs were expected to uphold. Customs that were less about pleasure and far more about politics, mythology, and the desperate attempt to keep divine order intact. Customs that, from a modern pillow saw perspective, seem so strangely ceremonial that one wonders how anyone involved kept a straight face. But the Egyptians kept them century after century, because tradition has a way of becoming truth when repeated long enough. One of the most curious ritual expectations, something hinted at earlier but not fully explored, was the pharaoh's responsibility to renew creation through symbolic acts. These acts did not necessarily require anyone else to participate. In fact, several older temple inscriptions imply that the king was expected to reenact the first moment of creation alone. Scholars translate this delicately, usually with long footnotes explaining that the Egyptian universe began with a spontaneous generative event by the creator god. You can imagine the rest. Was this taken literally by pharaohs? Perhaps not always. But the symbolism was there, hovering quietly in temple texts, suggesting that the king had to embody the primal force of life, an idea that probably felt heavier the longer one sat with it. It's one thing to govern a kingdom. It's another to be told you must periodically remind the universe how life began. It's the sort of job description that would make even the most confident ruler sigh deeply into a ceremonial cushion. This theme, cosmic renewal through royal symbolism, flowed into several related practices, especially during major festivals. Take, for example, the Opet festival, a grand celebration in Thebes. The king, acting as Horus, had his relationship with the goddess-like queen reenacted through ritual, procession, and sacred drama. Again, these reenactments were symbolic, but the message was very clear. Royal union kept Egypt alive. The marriage of pharaoh and queen wasn't simply domestic. It was metaphysical infrastructure. The Egyptians adored metaphysical infrastructure. We also shouldn't drift past the ritual bedrooms built inside certain temples. Not ordinary bedrooms, certainly not romantic retreats, but sacred chambers decorated with scenes of divine union. Pharaoh with his queen, the gods of their consorts, life begetting life in orderly cosmic loops. Some of these rooms were used for ceremonies during coronation periods or fertility festivals. A few seem to have been intended strictly for symbolic consummation, where the king affirmed his connection to the divine cycle through ritual rather than bodily experience. And as always, the priest recorded everything in thick, florid language. Nothing simple, nothing direct. Every inscription reads like a poetic riddle, as though the priest had wanted to remind future readers that they alone held the decoder ring. These practices weren't isolated to Thebes or Memphis. Even in distant desert temples, shrines perched on cliff sides, sanctuaries hollowed into stone, the message repeated like a lullaby in sandstone. The king's fertility was Egypt's fertility. His union with the queen was a union of land and sky. His virility was the Nile's generosity. No pressure, of course. Then there was a practice of divine birth propaganda. something we touched on in earlier parts but can now gently expand upon. Pharaohs often claimed that their conception happened through a goddess visiting their mother in a dream, or through the god Amunius taking the form of the queen's husband. This wasn't simply myth-making. It was political strategy. If the king's conception had been divine, then all his later generative duties, ritual, symbolic, or dynastic, were divine by inheritance. This narrative came with consequences, because if your birth was framed as a reenactment of the gods, your own reproduction could not simply be ordinary. It had to match the divine template. That meant marrying the right person, often a sister or a half-sister, or someone who would convincingly play the role of Isis, Hathor, or Mut without causing a palace scandal. Sometimes this worked beautifully. Sometimes it created family trees shaped like tightly wound spirals. The Egyptians, however, were unbothered. They'd say, the gods marry within the family, and carry on, as if that settled the matter. But even beyond the royal family, Egypt had a unique way of ritualizing intimacy. Consider the sacred gardens attached to certain temples. Lush, shaded spaces filled with symbology. Flowers like the blue lotus carried meanings of rebirth, awakening, and sensual vitality. Not in a salacious way, but in a cosmic, life renews itself kind of way. These gardens weren't secret love groves, though popular imagination loves that idea. They were more like symbolic greenhouses of fertility mythology, where priests told stories linking human family life to divine cycles. The pharaoh, unsurprisingly, was the centerpiece of every metaphor. And yet, for all these symbolic expectations, Egyptian cultural attitudes toward intimacy were generally more grounded and practical than the rituals imply. Everyday Egyptians married for companionship, affection, or household stability. But the pharaoh? He married mythically, politically, ritually. His relationships weren't judged by the standards of love or emotion. They were judged by whether they matched the cosmic script. Even failure was framed symbolically. If a royal couple didn't produce an heir, it wasn't seen as a personal tragedy. It was interpreted as a disturbance in the harmony of the universe. No pressure at all. Drifting back toward the Ptolemaic era again, we see these customs take on new layers. The Greeks appreciated symbolism, but they weren't nearly as concerned with cosmic fertility or ritual renewal. Yet, once ruling Egypt, they adopted the traditions with surprising enthusiasm. Or, perhaps more accurately, with reluctant acceptance. The ritual obligations came with the throne, like an ancient warranty no one understood, but no one dared violate. This is why Ptolemaic rulers, hard-edged generals, pragmatic administrators, and occasionally dramatic intellectuals found themselves wrapped in Egyptian fertility symbolism. It's why queens like Arsinoe II and Cleopatra VII were styled as incarnations of Isis. It's why many Ptolemaic royal couples took on sibling marriage traditions to mirror divine unions. Whether they personally believed any of it was beside the point. Symbolism ruled Egypt long after political power moved elsewhere. By this late stage, though, there was a shift. Earlier pharaohs had been expected to generate renewal through ritual acts. Ptolemaic kings, by contrast, were expected to generate legitimacy through display. Their symbolic unions weren't cosmic maintenance rituals anymore. They were political performances meant to persuade Egyptians that their Hellenistic rulers truly belonged on the throne. And so, in temples across Egypt, relief carvings showed these foreign-born kings performing ancient rituals with impeccable form. Even if, off-stage, they'd been practicing the choreography with slightly confused Greek advisors minutes beforehand. The symbolism of intimate union remained, but the purpose changed. It was less about sustaining the cosmos, and more about sustaining public confidence. Still, there were moments when the old meanings resurfaced. Cleopatra VII, in particular, embraced the symbolic aspects of fertility and divine union more enthusiastically than her predecessors. She wasn't simply performing for tradition. She was performing for survival. Aligning herself with Isis, portrayed her son as a new Horus, framing her relationships in divine language. These weren't strange indulgences. They were political strategies. Ancient Egypt had given her a script, and she followed it masterfully. Throughout all these centuries, the central truth remained. For the pharaoh, intimacy was never just intimacy. It was mythology turned into expectation. Family life turned into cosmic metaphor. Private experience stretched across the heavens. Strange by modern standards, yes, but deeply logical within the Egyptian worldview. And now, as we near the end of this part, we can see why these practices endured so long. They offered comfort, continuity, the feeling that even in political chaos, the cycle of life, symbolic or ritualized, still held the world together. And for a civilization that thought in terms of eternity, these rituals probably felt as natural as a flood of the Nile. Before we drift into part 10, let me ask you something soft and simple. If you lived in ancient Egypt, would you find these symbolic expectations magical or mildly exhausting? Whisper your thoughts in the comments. And as we ease out this long drift through ancient Egypt's strangest royal customs, let your mind settle like sand after the Nile's quiet retreat. These rulers, with all their rituals, myths, and symbolic responsibilities, remind us that even the most powerful people lived inside stories they didn't always choose. If you enjoyed this gentle wander through history, feel free to tap like, share it forward, or subscribe so you can join me again on another soft, meandering night. And before you drift off completely, tell me, what part of this strange royal world lingered with you the most? Good night, sweet dreams.